The PAK-DA stealth bomber project, officially designated as the Prospective Aviation Complex for Long-Range Aviation, stands as a colossal monument to Russia's diminishing capacity to execute ambitious strategic modernization efforts within its bomber fleet, a program so thoroughly beset by an avalanche of insurmountable challenges and perpetual delays that its very existence has become a symbol of failure rather than future capability. This initiative, intended to propel Russia into a new era of aerial strategic deterrence, has instead devolved into a painfully protracted development saga, each passing year adding fresh layers of doubt and skepticism regarding its ever-receding prospect of achieving any semblance of the operational status so confidently proclaimed at its outset. The chasm between its grandiose aspirations and the grim reality of its progress is now so vast that the PAK-DA is less a future weapon system and more a case study in how complex defense projects can spectacularly implode under the weight of their own ambitions, compounded by a deteriorating geopolitical and economic landscape. One of the most glaring and persistent condemnations of the PAK-DA initiative has been the catastrophic and unending delays that have utterly ravaged its development timeline, transforming initial optimism into a running joke within aerospace circles. What was once envisioned as a flagship program, with Russia boldly projecting an operational bomber by the mid-2020s and a flying prototype gracing the skies in the early part of that same decade, has now degenerated into a quagmire of missed deadlines and continuously deferred expectations. A toxic brew of deep-seated technical deficiencies, chronic financial emaciation, crippling international sanctions, and bewilderingly erratic political directives has conspired to repeatedly shove the project further into an indeterminate future. The most current, and likely wildly optimistic, projections now whisper of potential operational status sometime in the 2030s, though many independent analysts view even this distant horizon with profound incredulity, suggesting it may never materialize in any meaningful form. These delays are not mere schedule slips, they represent a fundamental breakdown in project management and an inability to overcome core obstacles, exacerbated by the Russian military's fickle and ever-shifting requirements. The priorities within the Russian defense industrial complex have also demonstrated a lamentable instability, frequently relegating the PAK-DA to a low-priority afterthought, starved of resources and attention in favor of programs perceived as more immediately critical or, perhaps, simply less complex and therefore less prone to abject failure, such as the desperate attempts to modernize existing, aging platforms. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 has only amplified these pressures, diverting colossal financial and material resources towards immediate wartime consumption, leaving visionary, long-term projects like the PAK-DA starved and increasingly irrelevant. On a purely technical level, the PAK-DA has been an unmitigated disaster, confronting design and performance challenges so profound they appear virtually insurmountable for Russia's current technological base, especially in light of severely restricted access to Western technology and components following waves of international sanctions. The project's cornerstone, its much-vaunted stealth capabilities, intended to render it nearly invisible to enemy detection systems and thereby grant it a decisive edge over increasingly obsolete older bombers, has proven to be an engineering nightmare of epic proportions. The Herculean task of sculpting an airframe that not only possesses a minimal radar cross-section but can also sustain intercontinental operational ranges while carrying a substantial strategic payload has thrown up a relentless barrage of design contradictions and intractable problems. The delicate, almost impossible, balancing act required to reconcile its low observability characteristics with the pressing demands for extended flight endurance, a voluminous weapons bay, and powerful, efficient engines has resulted in a cascade of design obstacles. Engineers have been perpetually trapped in a frustrating cycle of attempting to perfect the aircraft's specifications, only to find their efforts stymied by fundamental limitations in materials science, aerodynamic modeling, and systems integration. These deeply embedded technical hurdles have not just slowed progress, they have effectively paralyzed it, preventing the project from achieving any significant forward momentum and raising serious questions about whether Russia possesses the indigenous capability to produce a genuinely effective stealth bomber, particularly when compared to the decades of iterative development and enormous investment poured into similar programs by competitor nations. The lack of access to crucial Western-supplied advanced composite materials, sophisticated avionics, and precision manufacturing tools, a direct consequence of sanctions, has further compounded these technical woes, likely forcing designers into suboptimal compromises that will inevitably degrade the aircraft's intended performance and stealth characteristics, assuming it ever even reaches a production stage. Furthermore, a pervasive and damning ambiguity has consistently shrouded the PAK-DA's designated role within Russia's overarching strategic military doctrine, a lack of clarity that has significantly contributed to the project's glacial pace and questionable utility. While the Russian military leadership nominally identified a requirement for a next-generation strategic bomber to eventually supplant its aging fleets of Tu-95 Bear turboprops and Tu-160 Blackjack supersonic bombers, a fierce and unresolved internal debate has raged regarding precisely how, or even if, the PAK-DA would integrate effectively within the existing Air Force structure and contemporary strategic calculus. Numerous military strategists and defense analysts have openly questioned the fundamental necessity of pursuing such an enormously complex and astronomically expensive man-penetrating bomber in an era increasingly dominated by long-range precision-guided munitions, advanced cruise missiles, hypersonic weapons, and sophisticated unmanned aerial platforms, many of which are perceived as capable of achieving similar strategic objectives with arguably less risk and at a fraction of the cost. This profound uncertainty regarding the bomber's specific mission profile and its relevance in future conflict scenarios has made it extraordinarily difficult to solidify definitive operational requirements, leading to a chaotic cycle of design alterations, scope creep, and yet more debilitating delays, as the project lurches from one ill-defined concept to another. The ongoing war in Ukraine has starkly highlighted the vulnerabilities of even advanced aircraft to modern air defenses and the utility of less exquisite, more treatable systems, further eroding the strategic case for a platform like PAK-DA. The project's financial underpinnings have been equally disastrous, with severe and chronic funding limitations playing a decisive role in the PAK-DA program's protracted stagnation. Russia's defense budget, historically prone to unpredictable fluctuations driven by volatile global energy prices, internal political power struggles, and the ever-present specter of corruption, has been decimated by the cumulative impact of stringent international sanctions imposed following the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and massively escalated after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. This dramatically constrained economic environment has severely curtailed the financial resources available for almost all of Russia's ambitious military modernization programs. The PAK-DA, by its very nature an exceedingly expensive undertaking involving bleeding-edge, and often unproven within Russia, stealth technologies, exotic materials, and highly complex manufacturing processes, has been disproportionately impacted by these draconian financial constraints. Persistent funding shortfalls, outright budget cuts, or agonizingly slow disbursement of allocated funds have frequently compelled the Tupolev Design Bureau, the lead contractor, to reluctantly pause critical development phases, dramatically slow down research and testing activities, or shelve essential component procurement, thereby inexorably extending the already grotesque timeline for the bomber's potential, and increasingly hypothetical, entry into service. The Kremlin's prioritization of immediate wartime production and replenishment of staggering equipment losses in Ukraine means that futuristic, high-cost R&D projects like PAK-DA are at the absolute bottom of the funding pecking order, if they are on it at all. Adding to this litany of failures, the PAK-DA, which was ostensibly conceived to address a critical future gap in Russia's strategic aviation capabilities, has suffered immensely from intensifying competition from other, often more pragmatic or politically favored, military programs that have successfully diverted scarce attention, skilled personnel, and, crucially, financial resources away from the beleaguered bomber project. The development and troubled introduction of the Su-57, Russia's purported fifth-generation fighter jet, for instance, absorbed a disproportionate share of the military's focus and budget as it was deemed a higher immediate priority for maintaining air superiority and advanced fighter capabilities. Consequently, vital resources, both financial and intellectual, that might otherwise have been channeled into accelerating the PAK-DA's development were instead systematically redirected towards addressing the myriad problems and production bottlenecks plaguing the Su-57. This debilitating shift in focus was not merely a consequence of financial triage but also reflected a fundamental reordering of strategic priorities. Russia's perceived urgent requirement for more advanced fighter aircraft, however flawed their own development, consistently overshadowed the less immediate, and increasingly debatable, urgency for a new strategic bomber, especially one as problematic as the PAK-DA. More recently, the decision to restart production of the modernized Tu-160M Blackjack, a Cold War-era design, signals a near-total abandonment of the PAK-DA concept in practical terms, as resources are poured into a known, if dated, quantity rather than the bottomless pit of the next-generation bomber. Moreover, the constantly shifting sands of geopolitical alignments and the rapidly evolving nature of military threats have further contributed to the project's chronic delays and diminishing relevance. The Russian Ministry of Defense has been repeatedly forced to reassess its overarching defense strategy and force posture in direct response to the dramatically changing international security landscape and the unforeseen consequences of its own foreign policy adventures, most notably the disastrous war in Ukraine. The perceived strategic importance of a platform like the PAK has been progressively eroded as Russia grapples with adapting to new and emerging forms of warfare, including sophisticated cyber warfare capabilities. Advanced missile defense systems proliferate globally, and the disruptive potential of autonomous drone technologies and hypersonic weapons becomes undeniable. This pervasive uncertainty surrounding the bomber's long-term utility and survivability in a rapidly modernizing and increasingly contested global battlespace has inevitably led to significant shifts in defense priorities and resource allocation, further obstructing any consistent progress on the PAK project and pushing it closer to complete irrelevance. The lessons from Ukraine, where advanced air defenses have severely restricted air operations for both sides, cast an even darker shadow over the viability of a slow, large, man-penetrating bomber, no matter how stealthy it claims to be. The PAK was initially trumpeted as a revolutionary, game-changing leap forward for Russian strategic aviation, a symbol of technological prowess and resurgent military might. However, as things stand, its prospects are not merely uncertain, they are catastrophically bleak. The toxic confluence of crippling technical deficiencies, insurmountable financial limitations, perpetually shifting military priorities, a degraded industrial base, the loss of access to critical foreign components and technology due to sanctions, and the profoundly altered geopolitical environment has resulted in the project being not just severely delayed but fundamentally compromised, its very necessity now widely questioned even within Russia. Even in the wildly improbable scenario that the PAK is somehow eventually cobbled together and stumbles into some form of limited service decades behind schedule, it will have irretrievably missed any strategic window to revolutionize Russia's air power. Its ability to genuinely fill the operational gaps being slowly vacated by the steadily aging Tu-95s, and the limited fleet of Tu-160s, will be severely constrained, if not entirely negligible. At the most optimistic, and frankly delusional, projection, it might awkwardly complement these increasingly vulnerable legacy bombers. At worst, and far more likely, it will remain a perpetually unfinished project, a monumental white elephant that struggles profoundly to meet even a fraction of its original, overly ambitious objectives, ultimately representing billions of rubles squandered on a failed dream. In its disastrous trajectory, the PAK stealth bomber project serves as an extraordinarily stark and painful illustration of the monumental difficulties, bordering on impossibility, inherent in attempting to develop and field advanced military technologies under profoundly challenging and deteriorating conditions. It underscores the systemic weaknesses within Russia's defense industrial complex, its over-reliance on now inaccessible foreign technology, and the ruinous impact of strategic miscalculations and economic isolation. While the final nail in the PAK coffin has yet to be officially hammered in, the project is effectively moribund, a casualty of its own unmanageable complexity and the harsh realities of Russia's current global standing. It stands as a deeply cautionary tale, a glaring case study in the intricate, often fatal, interplay of technical ambition, financial reality, strategic coherence, and industrial capability, especially when such an endeavor is progressively choked by a tightening noose of sanctions, resource diversions to active conflicts, and a dawning realization that its core concept may be strategically obsolete before it ever leaves the drawing board. The silence surrounding its progress in recent times, contrasted with the active promotion of Tu-160M production, speaks volumes about its de facto cancellation, even if no formal announcement is ever made.